Hi, welcome to Ethical Implications of Psychological Research. This is in the Issues and Debates topic. There should be an I there. Issues and Debates topic on paper 3, and you can also use this like you can with the ethics in year 1 as evaluation for other points throughout the course. Okay, so firstly, what is an ethical issue and why does it matter? So this is a bit of a recap from what you learned about ethics in year 1 research methods. So ethical issues concern the debate surrounding moral principles of psychological research, and they usually are a debate. People can tend to write in assignments or exam questions that ethics is about right or wrong, or it's really black or white in a very polarized way. And most of the time, that's not the case. Ethical issues are debates around grey areas in research and the implications that those have. So, an ethical issue in psychological research is a conflict between what the researcher needs to do to get meaningful data for their work and from their work, and also the rights of the participants who are taking part in that research. And psychologists have a responsibility to ensure participants are treated in an ethically appropriate manner and that this is managed by a framework of ethical values. So, all psychologists will be part of an ethical framework. And they adhere to those guidelines to help them be an ethical practitioner if they're conducting research. This tends to be the BPS, the British Psychological Society in the UK, and the APA, the American Psychological Association in the USA. And both of these bodies publish guidelines to the wider field of social science as well, to advise on how ethical issues are being managed. So here we're really considering the ethical impact. So the way in which ethical implications impact participants, how the findings are communicated to the public, and how they are used. And that's an important issue in psychology. And for this part of the course, in considering ethical impact, we are mostly looking at social sensitivity. So the social sensitivity of research findings is of particular importance. And the term socially sensitive research refers to studies in which there are potential social consequences or implications, either directly for the participants involved or indirectly for the demographic of individuals that are represented by the research. And this is a quote by Sieber and Stanley. If you're using the textbook, you'll see their work is quoted on page 54 and 55. They are leading researchers in the social sensitivity of psychological research and how to manage that. So they found in their research in 1988 that there were actual aspects of the psychological research process, so how psychologists conduct research, that could end in creating research that is socially sensitive. So this aspect, this is all AO1, is looking at how research can become socially sensitive through the process of creating research in the first place. So the first thing is the research question. Sometimes the question being researched appears to add scientific credibility to privilege and prejudice within society. So, if a research question was, for example, is homosexuality inherited or are there racial differences in IQs, then both of these questions, when answered and then published in the research, will lend data and empirical value, scientific value behind the answer that is found in the research. So it can appear when you're reading it as though scientists, psychologists who we value highly in society are supporting prejudiced or privileged views in society by answering such questions. So members of demographics that are being represented here might be negatively impacted, particularly if the researchers are not members of those studied demographics. So in this example, if the researchers looking into whether homosexuality is inherited or if there's a racial difference in IQ were heterosexual and white, then it is likely that the impact of this in terms of social sensitivity would be stronger. So how can researchers address this? They need to be aware and educated about their own implicit or unconscious biases and be mindful of the language that they use in their research proposal publication, including the research question, and consider the potential use of the research when it's published as well. Who is going to use it? Who's going to get hold of it? Who's going to publish it? What media might comment on it, etc. And have they created the research to ensure that things won't be misinterpreted? Secondly, Sieber and Stanley pointed out that the conduct of research, so how it's carried out, and the treatment of participants is very important. So balancing maintenance of confidentiality and autonomy with participant rights and ethical obligation is important. And probably anonymity as well, which I'll come to later. For example, in research that uses participants who are HIV positive, a participant discloses that they have had unprotected sex. The researcher is then put in a position where they need to recognise that they have to protect the participant. So they may want to maintain confidentiality, as they've probably told the participant they would. And also to maintain anonymity. But at the same time, and they have an ethical responsibility to do that. But at the same time, they may then be drawn by the participant's disclosure to share confidentiality or to report what the participant has told them, because they also have a responsibility to protect the general public. So I'll come back to what I said at the beginning about debating and this being a grey area. There isn't a right or wrong. There is generally just a debate and a consideration of ethics that needs to happen around how the researcher is going to act in such a situation. So to manage situations like this before they arise, ideally researchers would create a confidentiality procedure that explains to participants that there are certain circumstances, usually outlined by the ethical framework the researcher follows, in which confidentiality needs to be shared. Explain and discuss that with the participant first before the research takes place to ensure they are fully informed before the study. And if confidentiality sharing is necessary, participants should ideally, if it's appropriate, be made aware that that is happening. Okay, third, the institutional context. So often with research, it is funded by somebody, and sometimes it is funded by private companies. So a good example of this could be from drug and medication companies who are sponsoring research into, say, the effectiveness of antidepressants. How will this affect the process? The person that's funding it is a company who are producing, marketing, and selling antidepressants. So how will that affect the process of the research? How will it affect who has access to the research? How the research is communicated and used after it? Again, in the textbook on page 54, there is an example of this called the All Trials Campaign. This found that the company that owns rights to choose what and how to publish and communicate findings is usually the company who is paying for the research to be done. And it denotes cases where in the past, drug companies have been accused of omitting or adapting information that has come out of psychological research to improve their own monetary gain. So they are more likely to make money from selling antidepressants if the research findings suggest that antidepressants are the most effective way of treating depression. So the research may be changed or adapted, and it may be that the private company even has the right to do that if they're paying for it. So researchers need to be mindful of how their data is going to be used, who is funding their research project, and if it is a private organisation, why are they conducting that research? What's the gain to them, and how do they intend to use their findings? What are they going to do with them? How will they be published? Who will be able to get hold of them? Can they be changed? What are the rights? So researchers need to be active in understanding the context of the research before it is conducted. And finally, in Stanley and Stieber's work, the interpretation and application of findings, which follows on quite nicely from the one before. So research findings are sometimes extrapolated and used inappropriately, whether they have come from a private company funding or not. For example, the development of IQ tests in Western psychological research has in the past been applied to cultures that are not Western and have different education systems. And then those findings have suggested that members of such communities have inferior IQs. This has been taken even further in past generations, where I think it says on page 54 of the textbook, people were then sterilised according to their IQ, and that happened considerably more in cultures where the research wasn't even conducted. So how can researchers address this? Consider whether research that you're doing is likely to be used to inform policy making. If so, publish guidance on how or which group findings can be appropriately applied. And advise on those in your work. Use language which minimises misinterpretation. And in the discussion section of your published research, acknowledge maybe any potential misinterpretations to make clear this is not what the research intends to show. And you may have seen from these four examples of how the research process can become socially sensitive and how researchers can address this, that often it is by acknowledging and being very clear that you've noticed the social sensitivity of research that actually helps it to become used appropriately and understood in the context that you've wanted it to be, rather than pretending it's not socially sensitive or not drawing any attention to it, and then it being misinterpreted. Okay, some additional AO1 information, a few more ethical issues in socially sensitive research. There are actually 10 of these that Stanley and Sieber found. All of them are on page 54, but it may be that you don't need quite that many. So if you find after this that you would struggle to write a 16 marker, you can go to page 54 in the Year 2 textbook and find some more ethical issues, but there might be enough information for you here. So privacy and informed consent. When research is socially sensitive, researchers may extract lots of highly personal information from participants. Participants may not fully comprehend that when they sign up, just how much they're likely to disclose, how much the researcher is likely to extract, etc. Second, confidentiality. With socially sensitive research, the boundaries of confidentiality in the name of participants' safety might be more vague. Participants may be less willing to give information on socially sensitive topics too, and they may, as I've said, only realise that when they are within the parameters of the research. Third, methodological impact. If poor methodology led to invalid findings, then these might be published by the media and they can lead to inaccurate conclusions, which then impact the public perception of the studied group. And four, deception. Self-deception can occur in socially sensitive research, where research leads people to form inaccurate stereotypes, which can then implicate their own behaviour. E.g., a young woman might read research claiming that females are bad at maths and then unconsciously doesn't try as hard in a maths test, achieving a low score. Okay, so here's an example exam question of how this has come up before. You've got a STEM here. In a study of antisocial activity and social background, researchers interviewed 100 children aged 14 years. They then classified each child according to their level of antisocial activity. They concluded 26 were very antisocial, 40 were mildly antisocial, and 34 were not antisocial. The researchers found that the majority of the very antisocial children attended Crayford Secondary School, whereas most of the other two groups of children attended another local school. The study is an example of socially sensitive research. Briefly explain how the researchers could have dealt with the issue of social sensitivity in this study. And this is for 4 marks, so there are 2 aspects to this question. Briefly explain how the researcher could have dealt with the issue of social sensitivity. So before you answer that, you've really got to say why that piece of research might be socially sensitive. Then you can say how they might address it. So I've written a model answer here. If research is socially sensitive, there are potential social consequences or implications for either the participants in the study or the social demographic the study represents. So just a short sentence about what social sensitivity is. In this example, there could be consequences for the school children who are participants, labelled as varying degrees of antisocial, the reputation of the schools in which they attend, and the public perception of their communities. So I have just applied there why that particular study is antisocial, why that particular study is socially sensitive. And then I've gone on to say how you'd address this. To address this, researchers must be mindful of the social implications and offer sensitive debriefing to participants, teachers, parents, and others who may be impacted by the research, namely the antisocial students, their parents, and the Crayford School. So I've named which part it is in the stem there. They must balance participant confidentiality and anonymity with safeguarding and take care in how findings and data are accessed, used, and published. Okay, now we move on to evaluation, the last part of the screencast. So I have got 3 evaluation points here. The first one's a limitation. Current ethical guidelines may be inadequate. Socially sensitive research has basically shown this to be the case. One limitation of current ethical guidelines is that psychological research may still inflict harm on a group of people in society. And this is because ethical guidelines primarily protect the participants involved in the research, but they do not deal with the ways in which that research impacts society. As Sieber and Stanley found, this can have lasting and damaging effects on significant proportions of society. Therefore, findings about the social sensitivity of research outlined some time ago have yet to be implemented into practice by ethical bodies. So that research was 1990, sorry, I put 1998 there, it's 1988. That research is really quite old, and yet the ethical guidelines haven't managed to find a way yet in which they can support psychologists to have wider engagement that would allow with public and professional bodies that would allow them to control a little bit more for social sensitivity. Okay, the second limitation, psychological research may disadvantage marginalised groups. Research into social sensitivity within psychological study has pointed out that our understanding of human behaviour may have been limited by the failure to include representative samples of minority cultures and demographics. Even more damaging is that these groups then miss out on the potential benefits of research, such as representation and potential policy change. Ultimately, by failing to be inclusive, both the individual and the wider psychological field are denied opportunity for further knowledge and representation. You may notice these evaluation points I'm using are the ones suggested on page 55 of the Year 2 textbook, but I have put them all into my own words, so you can probably find which ones they are from the top line, and I'd encourage you to write them out in your own words as well, because it will help you to understand and engage with each point. And then the final one, acknowledging socially sensitive research. To ensure socially sensitive research is used responsibly, it has been suggested that researchers must be clear that their research is socially sensitive when they publish it, and become active in ensuring its application and use is appropriate. If psychologists were supported in engaging with the wider society, public and policymakers, they could minimise the misuse of data and findings. So this point is really about, if we know about socially sensitive research and that it happens in the psychological research process, then psychologists could improve how this research is used and decrease opportunity for misrepresentation of it if they were more active, or they were supported by the ethical bodies to be more active in engaging with the public and policymakers in acknowledging that they have produced research which might be socially sensitive, and being very clear about that. Then we could do a lot more to protect people that are affected by socially sensitive research, and also to protect the field in that way too. Okay, so finally I've included a 16-mark example here. So you could be asked a 16-marker on social sensitivity. So that would be something like this: discuss the ethical implications of research studies and theory, including reference to social sensitivity. So in your AO1, you can define socially sensitive research first. What is socially sensitive? What does that mean? And then I would use Sieber and Stanley's research on the 4 aspects of the research process that implicate social sensitivity. So that's what we did near the beginning, these 4 here. So how the research question, conduct of the research, institutional context, and interpretation and application of findings can mean the research becomes socially sensitive. In this question, I would encourage you to spend more time on depth, really going through and making sure that your work is clear and that you are showing a depth of understanding of socially sensitive research, rather than listing sort of 10 points and just rattling through Stanley and Sieber's research on the aspects of the research process. It's not going to show the same argument and understanding if you do that. So, using the 4 aspects first, that might be enough for your AO1 for many of you, if you sort of aim for 3/4 of a page for that. If you need to, you could use the ethical issues in socially sensitive research that I went through as well, the additional ones. And if you really need to, then there are even more of those in the textbook. But as I said, aim for depth rather than breadth of understanding. And then for your AO3, you need about 3/4 or to a page of evaluation. So if you like the points I've run through here, they would be useful. There's also additional ones in the textbook on page 55, as I'd said. But yeah, really make sure that you're debating through your evaluation. You're debating how psychological research can negatively impact certain members of society and what we need to do as a profession to try and manage that. Remember what I said at the beginning, it's all about a debate. It's about looking at the grey area, and it's about really considering a moral and ethical responsibility that you have as a researcher, both to your participants, but then in extension to the wider public and the demographic that your research represents. Okay, any issues, speak to your teacher or attend a workshop about issues and debates, and bring your questions. Thank you.